I hope you all enjoyed the opening session. It's my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Ronald Arkin. Professor Ronald Arkin is Regents Professor and Associate Dean of Research in the College of Computing at Georgia Tech. He served as stint visiting professor at KTH in Stockholm, sabbatical chair at the Sony IDL in Tokyo, and in the Robotics and AI group at CNRS in Toulouse. Dr. Arkin's research interests include behavior-based control and action-oriented perception for mobile robots and UAV, deliberative and reactive architectures, robot survivability, multi-agent robotics, biorobotics, human-robot interaction, robot ethics, and learning in autonomous systems. Professor Arkin served on the Board of Governors of the IEEE Society on Social Implications of Technology, the IEEE Robotics and Automation Society, and is the founding co-chair of the IEEE RAS Technical Committee on Robot Ethics, and he is a distinguished lecturer for the IEEE Society on Social Implications of Technology and a fellow of the IEEE. Please welcome Dr. Ron Larken to give his plenary talk.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. My voice is a little raspy today, so please bear with me, and if I have to hold my microphone closer to my mouth as the day goes on, you'll know why. Today we're going to talk about robot ethics in a variety of different domains. I refer to this as civilized collaboration, which, again, the ways in which we treat each other that conform either to social norms or an ethical theory. We behave in certain ways because we are either forced to behave through law, we believe we should behave due to ethical underpinnings, or we are molded as a result of the society around us. We would like our robots to behave in a manner that is consistent with all of those laws, society, and our own ethical theories as well, too. So we can see, with respect to the proliferation of robots everywhere, and they are going everywhere, that many people are concerned about the implications of this technology. And it's not just loss of jobs. I'm not going to be talking about loss of jobs, although that is one of the crucial areas in robot ethics, but I'm not going to speak to that today. The issue is, what are we going to do as these robots start to pervade society, as they start to have impact on your own personal lives? Is it for the betterment of mankind, or is it for the detriment of mankind? This is one of the things that many of my colleagues, including myself, until about a decade ago, didn't pay a whole lot of attention to. Many of us get lost in the joy of curiosity-driven research. We find ourselves interested in research questions, and we need to ask ourselves, what if we actually answered those questions and we got satisfactory answers to those? This is important to know. Now, an interesting study was done in Europe a few years back, which involved 27,000 people. It was a survey which kind of surprised me, the output of these results. They asked, if there was robotics technology that should be banned, what should it be? And having worked in military robotics, and I'll talk a little bit about that today as well too, what was odd to me at first, it said care of children, elderly, and the disabled. Most people think, most roboticists think, and we are an arrogant bunch of scientists, we try and make answers for people who may not really want those particular answers. So are we doing the right thing by creating these kinds of technologies? Well, we either have a lot of education to do, or we may be looking in the wrong area. And I would contend that this issue is endemic to humanitarian robotics as well, too. We need to understand our customers. We can't be sitting in our laboratories coming up with ways to design things for villages in India without understanding and going into those villages in India and trying to determine what works and what doesn't. For example, again, the $100 laptop was a notable failure in terms of deployment around the world. But then again, for some reason, everyone has a cell phone. Everyone has a cell phone. So how did that technology succeed? not even designed for that particular purpose, to penetrate into society. We need to be careful as we move forward with robotics as well. Now, I'm going to talk about several different domains today. I'll be talking about military robotics, I'll be talking about some healthcare work that we're doing, and I'll be talking about robots that lie, the ethical questions associated with that. But let's talk first about this, because this is important. It is, to me, the most pressing issue confronting society today, the notion of the use of what are called lethal autonomous weapons. These are desired by the military for a variety of reasons. They provide distinct advantages for the warfighter in terms of seeing and acting further out into the battle space, multiplying the number, making it seem there are more warfighters available. So militaries generally want these. Now the question is, should a robot be given the authority to kill someone? And secondly, as we give authority to these particular robotic systems, should they comply with international humanitarian law? International humanitarian law are things like the Geneva Conventions. These are things that are created by a collection of nations, and many, not all, but many, including the United States, don't necessarily sign to them, but they subscribe to them as well, too. I believe it's about 183, and that's a lot within the world. But these systems are being built. They are being built, and they are being deployed, and there's a major debate going on worldwide with respect to what should be done. Some answer, many non-governmental organizations or NGOs, such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and Article 36, argue that there should be a preemptive ban on this particular technology. We should not even let it be created in the context of military systems. Others, like the Department of Defense in the United States, have put on what I refer to as a quasi-moratorium. Let's go slow, let's stop and think about this and not allow the deployment of this technology, in this case for 10 years. So it's a moratorium instead of saying we're never going to do that. And other approaches have come about. At the United Nations in Geneva, for the last 3 years, there were informal meetings of experts that they held at the UN. I had the honor and privilege of being one of them at the very first meeting of those and speaking before the UN. But what's of note to India, particularly important to India, it just happened Friday. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Probably not. But what happened Friday is the UN decided to move this from informal talks to formal talks, which is the first step towards a generation of regulations or bans or whatever. And His Excellency, the ambassador to Geneva from India, is the chair of the particular committee that's been set up, the Group of Governmental Experts, or GGE. So India is going to be playing a central role in this particular process, which I think is great. A non-aligned nation is one of the reasons why it was India, and it's going to be very hard to develop consensus with the Vatican and China and the United States and all sorts of different nations, and Afghanistan and Iraq. Everyone has a different perspective on that. So you may be hearing more about that in the future. I think His Excellency is Ambassador Gill, if I'm not mistaken, that will be, again, chairing and forming this particular committee. But one of the things I'm concerned with, much of what we heard going on here is concerned with acts of God, right? You have floods, you have landslides, you have earthquakes, you have all sorts of things. These are acts of man. These are human beings acting against human beings, often in utterly and inhumane ways. And first I have to say, there are two assumptions that underlie the work I've done in this particular area. One is that wars will continue. If you're a pacifist, I encourage you to continue in that goal and try and find ways to end war on the face of this planet. All of recorded history seems to make it rather challenging, at the least, to be able to do. And the second, which I will refer to quickly, is that lethal autonomous weapons are inevitable. And the reason why I believe they're inevitable is because they are basically here already. They already exist. But my concern is not with winning wars in this. My concern is looking at the suffering that goes on in non-combatants in the battle space. The slaughter is untold. It's only a partial story of the suffering and inhumanity that goes on as civilians are being killed. You hear it in Aleppo all the time. They still can't even evacuate them, let alone stop the war in that particular space as well, too. And I believe as roboticists and technologists, we have a fundamental responsibility to try and reduce suffering in that particular domain. If wars are going to continue, civilians are going to continue to die, and I believe robots can help assist in a reduction in the non-combatant casualties in that particular space. So I've dedicated some of my work in that particular area. We've done this. I'm not going to go into the technological aspects of this. If any of you are interested, please, on all of this stuff, just go visit my webpage. There's more technical material than you would probably like to see for that. But this is based on a variation of deontological logic, the logic of morality, if you will, of prohibitions, obligations, and permissions, and how these can be put to work in making a robot basically obey international humanitarian law. The goal here is to make robots behave better than human beings behave in the battlefield. And one of the things I've studied over the years is biological behavior, starting with frogs and toads. I worked on Sony with Aibo in looking at dog and human behavior in that particular context. And reading how human beings behave within the battle space is some of the most depressing reading that I have ever seen. So the question is, what can we do? And one of the things that we can do, as society has already created humanitarian law, is trying to engineer systems that will do better than human being warfighters in this particular space and comply. The way we did this, and I'm not going to take the hour, which I usually do, to explain it, is design a software architecture which enforces these constraints, the obligations to engage, and avoiding committing a prohibition that is engineered from the Geneva Conventions. This is not done in the sense of replacing human beings. We have no hope in the near term of being able to endow robots with full moral faculties by any stretch, but enabling them to comply with international humanitarian law is something I think is feasible. And only if and when we can achieve that and demonstrate it, only then, in my mind, can we introduce these systems into the battlefield. This would potentially result in a net savings of human life, and if you take a consequentialist approach from an ethical perspective, that translates, in my mind, at least to a humanitarian effort. And again, the details of this, and others are working on this at other places as well, too. So basically, is it possible in the situations where human beings break down due to anger and frustration and stress and commit atrocities or just make mistakes and resulting in the slaughter of non-combatants? Can we create systems that do better and thus reduce those casualties? That's the question. This was a video which when I presented in Brisbane at the World Science Festival, they graciously translated some of our rather coarse laboratory-grade videos into something a little more useful. But the goal here of we don't have lethal weapons in our laboratory, by the way. That's not what we do. But we looked at scenarios such as this, which were translated from real-world scenarios in many cases, and looked at how these systems could decide not just when to shoot, but more importantly, and this is the key factor, when not to shoot. When could they not shoot because there's a clear violation due to a target being located outside the rules of engagement and it's outside of a designated kill zone, where a human being may be opportunistic and stray in that particular case. Or under certain circumstances, if it happens to potentially maximize the likelihood of collateral damage. If any of you saw, what was that movie with Helen Mirren, Eye in the Sky? If you happen to see that movie, you could see how collateral damage. And they made a strong effort to try and reduce collateral damage. There was a human being in there that kind of got in the way without giving a spoiler for that. But we want to try and automate this particular process if we can. So these are the sorts of things that we've done. So with respect to lethal autonomous weapon systems, summarizing, to me, it is utterly and wholly unacceptable to say that we can tolerate the status quo with respect to non-combatant casualties. Too many people are dying, and technologists are not doing, I'm almost going to say strong words, but I won't, not doing a thing about it at this point in time. Now, maybe this is not the best solution. It is an approach, and I would encourage more folks to look into ways to help better protect innocent civilians in the battle space. To me, it's a humanitarian disaster that is often overlooked. And I do believe we need to educate our scientists. I argue, instead of a prohibition, for a moratorium, that we need to wait before we deploy these systems, because they may lead to greater problems. But if possible, we may be able to save non-combatant lives. So end part one.
Parkinson's causes debilitating shaking or loss of muscle control. Nessa Weinman is director of the Parkinson's Association in Los Angeles.
People are living very long lives with Parkinson's. You know, with Muhammad Ali, you see that his face is frozen. You know, perhaps Mr. Williams was afraid that that might happen. His facial expression is so much a part of who he is and what he does.
What we have done now is another project through the National Science Foundation's National Robotics Initiative, collaboratively with Tufts University, looked at how we can use actually some of the underlying military architectures that we did, the ethical governor and something called the ethical adapter, and introduce that into patient-caregiver relationships. Parkinson's is a disease where you get a facial masking, and that reduces the nonverbal communication channels to someone else, particularly your caregiver. And your voice starts to sound like mine, actually, right now. I could have used this as an example. It becomes raspy, so hopefully. You can have those problems. But the patient is still fully cognitive, but they have this inability now to express this emotion on their face. And that produces a loss of empathy in the caregiver over time. That means they just don't care, because they're not getting the necessary verbal feedback and nonverbal feedback that you normally expect. Even if they're saying, I'm having a great day today, they don't believe it at some particular point. And this phenomenon, referred to as stigmatization, is well documented and well known in this particular community. And what it does is it profoundly affects the relationship between the caregiver and the patient. The caregiver starts to lose empathy. They stop caring as much about the patient as they had before, or client. And the patient themselves starts becoming ashamed or embarrassed. So this causes a degradation in the quality of care, which eventually, from an economic perspective, causes people to have to be institutionalized earlier. But independent of that, it causes them to lose dignity. There is an erosion of dignity in this particular relationship. And what you might say is, okay, what can we do with a robot in that particular case? How can we make a robot help, whether it's ethical or not? So let me share those ideas with you as we move forward. But if we create a companion robot, and again, remember, I worked with Sony Aibo. Many of you remember the robot dog. Sony's starting up again, working on robotics finally after a long hiatus. But the robot dog was a companion, and we tried to design that so it would be in your life, and it would be in your life, ideally, for the rest of your life. It would be your partner, and it would be your friend, and it would be interesting like a regular dog would be. That's a hard problem. That's really hard to do. It's easy to make a robot dance, but it's hard to make you want a robot in your life for the rest of your life. It's hard enough to find a human being you want in your life for the rest of your life, in many ways. But what we're trying to do here is, based on some of those ideas that we had there, make the robot a bystander in this relationship. So many folks talk about human-robot interaction, and human-robot interaction deals with, there's a robot, there's a human, how do we interact? Well, we're interested in human-human interaction in this particular case. How can we mediate this relationship using a robot to ensure that the quality of the relationship remains within acceptable ethical bounds, if you will? That's not an easy problem either, and we're just beginning to explore this 3 years into a five-year effort. We haven't worked with Parkinson's patients yet, but we do work with elderly populations to date. So the main goals are the bullets on the right there. One of the biggest problems is this lack of congruence, this mental congruence that occurs between the patient and the caregiver. The patient may be feeling one thing, but the caregiver thinks they're feeling something else. And to try and draw those two things together is crucially important. We have modeled moral emotions in the military work. We modeled guilt, actually, as a mechanism for reducing collateral damage in the battle space. But we've extended those same kinds of models now into shame and embarrassment and empathy as building up a partial theory of mind. We actually call it partner modeling. A theory of mind is something that distinguishes human beings from almost any other species, although some argue that certain primates may have it as well, too, where basically you think you know what I'm thinking, or you think you know what someone else is thinking, and you maintain a model of that, and that helps guide your actions as well. What we're doing is we think you know what you're feeling with respect to these particular emotions, and trying to encourage the rapport through the use of what are called Kinesics, which is body language. India is rich with body language. I can't even do some of the head shakes that you do. I don't know how you do that one. I don't even know what it means, but it's just one example of many of the different forms that different cultures have different variations on body language, as well as proxemics, which is spatial separation. I'm at a socio-consultative distance right now, but if I liked, I could come down and get into an intimate space with any of you as well, too, but that would be inappropriate at this particular point. So maintaining the separation, one of the things you learn with IBO, for example, is as the robot goes over time, it becomes more familiar with you, just as a regular dog would, and it can start to get a little bit closer to you. And it differentiates you with the familiarity from someone that it doesn't know, in this case. And you like that because you recognize that as your friend then. As well. So what we've been working on is this notion of a social robot as a bystander. And we've done several studies on it, which I'm not going to go into in detail, using first a stuffed robot as our base case, where it's just basically a toy that would be sitting between the two human beings as we evaluated them. One is an interviewer who actually tries and deliberately introduces stress into the interview, to a now, which is the robot, that guy over here, which has relatively rich kinesics capabilities, and then ultimately looking at this Xeno. These are small robots as well too, which we just keep in proximity to the folks, which is capable of facial expressions, which you'll see in a bit. So the overall notion here is to put the robot in the room. Now, that's basically it. To make it non-intrusive, to basically, in some cases, just as if you had a dog sitting on your sofa and you started yelling at someone, maybe it would perk up its ears and look at you, and you might do some self-examination at that point in time and change the way in which you're speaking. Those sorts of things, as well as where we also go from occupational therapy manuals, where therapists are told this is what you should do under these circumstances, such as when someone starts to yell or when someone starts to leave the room. We actually use the ethical governor to intervene under those cases. Can you tell me about a time in your life? These show some multiple examples here of the three different types, just showing that there's an attending now. I guess I can't point at that. There's an attending now. The now turns its head back and forth, as does the Xeno. And what we wanted to understand first, we would like this to be basically as unintrusive to the discussion that's ongoing as a stuffed robot is. And we found that that's generally the case. What was nice is that the presence of the robot did not have an impact upon the interactions, at least at the level that we were talking about here. So we've taken these components for this mediator, as I mentioned before. The ethical adapter is an expanded version of the one that we did earlier for the military. The intervening ethical governor changes it from constraints from obligations and prohibitions to rules in this case, because it has to react differently as opposed to just turning a variable to true or false, and use the kinesics and emotional modeling that's available in other components of our lab. TAME model, which is work that we did for Samsung a few years back as well too. So these are the sorts of things that we can put to work in this particular system. So the whole notion of the governor now, which is not as subtle as the ethical adapter would be, this actually, when bounds are crossed by one of the two people in the relationship, the robot will actually intervene under these circumstances when inappropriate behaviors or dignity is violated. This is done through an architecture. For those of you familiar with architectures, that's a very high-level view, looking at the way in which we change that information to actually, it was using a rule-based system. I think that's our older one shown in that particular diagram. But basically, it uses rules to accomplish that. And those rules look something like this. These come from occupational therapy manuals. So this is how you are trained as an occupational therapist when these things happen in the room. So people are not allowed to yell. They shouldn't use foul language. They shouldn't overly interrupt. If you become quiet or withdrawn, or if you choose to leave, and if you do something that's unsafe under those circumstances, the robot is expected to intervene in a way which combines both nonverbal and verbal communication in this case. This shows some examples.
Okay, it says to take 2 on an empty stomach once a day.
Good. So use the medication organizer and prescription directions to sort these pills. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Can't open the bottle.
Okay, but can you try one more time?
No, I already said I can't open it, okay?
I understand. Let's calm down a little bit.
We're using focus groups, actually. That's just an exemplar.
I'll try it just one more time.
We're using focus groups to try and get the correct response, what would be acceptable, because we don't want people throwing the robot out the window at the same time as well. So that is a concern. There are several others embedded here, but for the interest of time, I'm going to skip past them. But it's this notion, again, of shame and dignity, and how do we influence it in this particular case in human-human relationships. There are potential generalizations of this as well, too, beyond Parkinson's, but that's the area that we're looking at initially because it's so well studied and documented. But parent-child relationships. I had 4 teenagers, okay, so there were always issues at times as well in terms of who's in charge. If you've been married, you know that you will have arguments and other things as well too going on, and sometimes the dignity is crossed. Would it hurt to have a robot therapist sitting around assisting in those cases to try and normalize relations? Perhaps not. But like I say, this is all very fundamental basic research. We have to determine and assess whether it works effectively first, but this is what we are exploring in this case. The way in which we look at shame, these have been analyzed from the components. We use both language, parsing natural language speech for certain terms, as well as physiological signals as well too. We try and do this unobtrusively with a specialized watch, a little better than an Apple Watch, which can provide the data that we use. And empathy is the thing we want to encourage. So we want to reduce shame and anger and frustration and embarrassment in the patient, and we want to increase empathy in the caregiver. Sometimes that becomes a deliberative aspect for that, and there are similar components as well too. And we have to find ways, and we have structured ways, and Michael Pettinati is doing his dissertation in this particular area as well too, which he's making really good progress. The overall framework looks kind of like this. Again, not at a gory detail level, but at a high level as well too. Modeling those components and monitoring those components, so when they reach unacceptable levels, we can change that. The way in which we act, as I mentioned before, is based on kinesics and proxemics. The work that I can point out is work we did with Sony earlier on Curio, which is a small humanoid. This basically shows a greeting behavior.
Nice to
For a Japanese robot, this was in Japan when I was in Tokyo working with them. You notice it bows. That's not a typically American behavior, but it's a Japanese behavior. Then we start introducing what we call behavioral overlays on top of that, which change the body language. The same behavior was present, but the body language and the proxemics changed as well. So if an old friend came over, same fundamental behavior. We overlaid this, it got a little bit closer. It bows deeper and longer in this case because it was a friend, but it's not completely tolerant.
Hey, listen to me.
Now keep in mind, despite what you might think, the robot is feeling absolutely nothing. But we are modeling those emotions in there. It's exhibiting emotions that in the ways in which you might expect to see them. But there is no feeling or sentience within the agent itself. Now if Curio is angry, it might be a little different. Curio is also capable of remembering you from the last time it saw you and stored state about that. Has to bow, it's Japan, right? Even if you're angry, so. It's not paying attention at this particular point. Another behavioral overlay in this. And it might feel a tad threatened at some point. And basically, as it gets closer, a little slow because of the computation.
Curio, pay attention.
It's kind of said that's the best we could do in that particular case to stay away at this point. So those are the sorts of things that we were working on. We've had, for this particular project, we've introduced what used to be called Xeno and now is called Milo, and used the facial expressions. We have run one study on this. I don't have time to go in it as well, too. Understanding, do the facial expressions creep people out, or do they actually help in the communication? There's something, as you know, from an eminent Japanese scientist called the uncanny valley, and if you start making robots look too close to humans, they might not like them even less than they, even not like them more than they would otherwise as well too. But we're exploring this particular case for this robot to determine whether it can potentially provide some of those nonverbal cues that might trigger the kinds of interactions that we're referring to. Okay, so summarizing again, the goal of this particular project is not to save non-combatant lives, that's important, but this one is to preserve human dignity in human-human relationships. And can a robot potentially assist in that particular process? That's what we're studying by and large through the understanding and reducing the loss of dignity in these particular relationships. And the last major project I'll be talking about is deceit, deception. How much time do I have left? I have to check. Okay. Oh, I got time. Good. Lots of interesting things with respect to deception. One of the things about deception is that the smarter you get in an intelligent machine, the more likely that machine is going to be able to deceive you. That was a phenomenon by Dan Dennett. He talked about it as well, too. But as we get them smarter and smarter, and if we start modeling the mind of the other, in other words, I know what you're thinking, well, maybe I can use that to my advantage, right? I can do something to accomplish it. And deception is everywhere in nature. It's everywhere. In many cases, it's inherent to survivability for certain species as well, too, whether it's through camouflage, whether it's through particular behavioral actions. But this notion of deception is often a key criteria for a theory of mind model. And again, that statement by Dennett is down there again, I guess for reinforcing. But this shows some examples. The first one that you see there is called a broken wing display. This is where a bird mother has a nest there, and a predator is coming along, and it feigns its wing is broken so that the predator will go after that, and it draws it away from the nest. The other one down below there is an interesting one. Here, this is a behavior in chimpanzees, which if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. This is a mother and the son. She notes that the son has a great set of tools for cracking and eating. That's good. So there's a reciprocal behavior which is present here. And as such, the dutiful son is obligated to scratch his mother's back, which he dutifully does. But along the way, she kind of takes advantage of that. And in slow motion, it kind of looks like this. Okay, so this is, she didn't just come and overpower them, but they took the tools. Now, did your parents ever treat you like that? I don't know, but that's an interesting example that goes on there. And of course, the camouflage, which I mentioned before. Other examples include in sports. Now, in soccer and in football, often you cheer in basketball. You cheer when your team does something to trick the other guy, right? That's the greatest thing you ever saw. You're up in the street. He feinted and went around and dunked the ball, or he kicked the goal, went around the guy and kicked it into the net. I'm trying to think of an example in cricket, but I can't do it. I don't think there is an example of deception in cricket. And if it would be in incredibly slow motion. This is an example of deception for the benefit of the mark. In this particular case, now, is that ethically warranted or not? These are questions that we have to wrestle with. And again, this notion of human-robot interaction. If you're a philosopher and you're a deontological philosopher, a pure Kantian, you would know that lying under any circumstances is never acceptable because it violates the categorical imperative. Well, life is not always like that. Sometimes you may say something to someone that you might not say if you were telling the complete truth. For example, if my wife comes up to me and she had put on a brand new sari, let's just put it in that context. She says, "How do I look?" I know the answer. I don't even have to see her, right? You look great, my dear. That's the kind of thing that you do, whether it's truth or not. And there's other examples as well, too, in scaffolding and education. If you're trying to educate somebody and you have a big classroom and everyone's a genius, you're really great. You're all doing super well. Well, maybe not, but you encourage them through those sorts of things. And same perhaps with your children in sports and the like. Other deception is quite commonplace. Some call it white lies or whatever, but it's still deception. It's still not telling the truth. So the real question is, do you want your robot to tell you the truth? The unvarnished, blunt, Kantian truth. I don't know. Let's look a little bit into it. This was a movie called Interstellar. I don't know if any of you saw it or not. This was a robot over here, this guy Tars. It was one of the strangest robots I've seen, but it was really cool.
90%.
90%.
Absolute honesty isn't always the most diplomatic, nor the safest form of communication with emotional beings.
Okay. 90% it is, Dr.
So he actually said, okay, keep it at 90%. I don't really need to know the unvarnished truth completely. So there's questions, again, about opting in and opting out or having a dial, which is kind of interesting because some of our approaches to this actually address that particular problem. Now, if you do military research, it's adversarial, not unlike sports as well, too. Sun Tzu said that all warfare is based on deception, and Machiavelli argued, paraphrasing, that deceit is detestable in all other things, yet in the conduct of war it is laudable and honorable. There's an entire field manual in the United States on battlefield deception as well. So, like I said, it's commonplace in nature and it's commonplace in everyday life. Whether it should be or not is a separate question. These are the ethical questions that we have to fundamentally wrestle with. So we did 4 different approaches on this, looking at a form from psychology called Interdependence Theory. I'm not going to talk much about that other than show a few quick results. Looked at bird types of deception as well too, or bird honesty, and trying to contort that into deception. Squirrels, which lie to each other through their tracking of caches. And other-oriented deception, which is really the one I'm going to be talking about because one of my students is just about to complete her dissertation on this subject if I ever get finished with her next to last chapter. One of the ways, without showing how we did it, and I refer you to the technical papers I said, we tested this was in a simple hide-and-seek experiment. Now, how many of you remember Star Wars 4, which was Star Wars 1. Remember Star Wars 4, Star Wars 1? That was not the prequel, that was not the sequel, it was the first one of the first ones. And in the beginning, again, R2-D2 had the plans, and he had to go hide in a corner, and he just went and hid in a corner to avoid detection by the stormtroopers. Well, that's not the smartest thing you can do. I mean, you could lay down a false trail. You see human beings doing this as well, too. Part of maintaining that theory of mind. I know you're going to follow me, and if I create a false trail, it's likely that you will follow me as well. So we did this, and the net effect of this particular experiment, relatively simple. What was interesting were the mathematical underpinnings of this as well, too, where we had a robot trying to deceive another robot, in this particular case, in a straightforward example, where we had markers which could lead to clues as to what direction. We used a Bayesian decision-making model, so it wouldn't always be the same because it wouldn't work under those circumstances persistently. And then the robot goes and hides in a different location. And again, these are really dumb robots, but the point taken from our approach here was to verify the work that we did in simulation as well, too. And what's kind of interesting, again, we're not surprised that the robot, in this case, he thought it would follow the way over there, and it goes that particular way, which gives time for the other robot to find its way out and escape. And they're not always the same, as I mentioned before. So what we showed in that particular experiment, oops, I'm going the wrong way. Go on. Well, the two things, that in this interdependent space, which was this computational space that we used, we showed that we can find when it's appropriate to use deception, which is crucially important, because if you don't know when, or you use it at the wrong time, it won't work, and also how. We can determine what and which false communication to use under those particular set of circumstances. So in our first paper, and this is just to give you some context, we said the following at the end. Again, the results do not represent the final word on robots and deception. The results are a preliminary indication that techniques and algorithms described in this paper can be fruitfully used to produce deceptive behavior in a robot. Much more psychologically valid evidence will be required to strongly confirm this hypothesis. I think that sounds like a responsible scientist, kind of qualifying his results. Well, here we go, okay? So the press, you guys somewhere in this room, you guys out there, not necessarily here in India, but I think it probably made its way here as well too, said like, researchers at the Georgia Institute of Technology may have made a terrible, terrible mistake. They taught robots how to deceive. It probably seemed like a good idea at the time, but when machines rise up against humans and the robot apocalypse arrives, we're all going to be wishing that Ronald Arkin and Alan Wagner had kept their ideas to themselves. Okay, so we created the end of the world, but it gets worse. Okay. Ronald Arkin and Alan Wagner, two names likely doomed to live in infamy. In a stunning display of hubris, the men, researchers from Georgia Institute of Technology, published a paper in the International Journal of Social Robotics that detailed their foolhardy experiment to teach two robots how to play hide and seek. Okay, so maybe I'm a bad guy, I don't know. Let's keep going. Robots capable of deceiving humans built by crazed boffins. That was one of my favorites as well, too. So, and we did talk about in the paper the ethical implications as well, too, and we're fully aware of it as we were moving forward.
And all along, we've assumed, folks, that robots were innocent servants until now. Scientists at Georgia Tech have taught robots how to lie, presumably to tell whoever gave them the research grant that their money was well spent. These Georgia Techs are the same brainiacs that last year built a robot that plays jazz. Now they've created a robot that can lie and say it likes jazz.
So this is the danger of working in these particular spaces as well. I was concerned when my funding agent saw that as the things. I called him up and I said, what do you think? And he said, do you want us to do more deception? He said, yes, we want more deception. So the good news was he wasn't fazed by Colbert in this case. But at the same time, we also got, equally inappropriately, one of the 50 best inventions of 2010 by Time magazine. First of all, I don't even think it's an invention, but somehow it was considered a great breakthrough, at least by Time magazine as well. Perhaps the most responsible reporting here was in New Scientist, where they talked about any computational code that supports the external behavioral properties of theory of mind and deception can help us understand what's going on in the human mind. That's what I would have liked to have heard more of, but I heard a whole lot more of the other rather than otherwise. So it's a dangerous field to be in. And then we started looking at squirrel-like deception, encouraged by my funding agent in this case. The squirrels go back and forth. They change their strategy in the presence of a predator in patrolling caches. They bury their nuts, and then they worry about their nuts. So they go and check on them, and they go over here, and they check on their nuts, and they keep checking back and forth. And then they see another squirrel, and they see, I'm going to go over here and look over here and look over here. They change their strategy to reduce the likelihood of pilferage, which we thought was a good idea. So we put it on a robot, and we tested it. But what's interesting is that look how the media responded as well, too. They love it. Squirrels are cute. Squirrels are nice. We like squirrels. So the press coverage was really favorable for this. As long as it's squirrels, not psychological theories of human that are lying, no problem with that. And so then we moved into this notion of other-oriented deception, and this is the work that's being completed as we speak. We took an approach that's inspired by criminological law, and it's using a similar computational model, but in this case with the goal of improving the relationship and the benefits accrued for the mark, as it's referred to. And we looked at it in the context initially of search and rescue studies, but we found we were never going to get approval from an IRB where we actually have to put a human being in danger because then we'd have to deceive them, but then we're checking on the deception of it, not the real thing as well, too. So we translated that around to a different set of contexts and actually related more to the Parkinson's kind of tasks. This criminological model took into account both motive, method, and opportunity. We fused that into the system to be able to do that. We also considered the two different types of ways in which you can deceive. Deception by commission, it's over there when it's actually over there, or deception by omission. I don't know, or whatever, not do anything under those circumstances. So we've explored those in this particular context. We've generated sets of proxemics and kinesics in this particular case for the now to try and trick people, and we use deceptive user studies. Again, you can see the results on our paper, but the net effect is that it does work, and hopefully it will indeed accrue benefit to the mark under these circumstances. A classic movie, it's not far from a classic movie, but a good exemplar movie that illustrates this is Horrible Bosses 2. If you've ever seen it, I feel sorry for you. But if you there's one scene in it, though, near the end, and I have no problem in issuing a spoiler here, where a guy gets shot and the two buddies are standing over him, and one says, "Oh my God, you're going to die. You look horrible." And the other guy says, "Don't tell him that. You'll be fine. Everything's okay." "No, he's not. He's going to die. Look at him." But what EMTs and others are often trained is to try and reduce the likelihood of shock, even if it involves deception under these cases as well, too, to keep the blood pressure down and maybe give a vestige of hope. Now, that may be unethical if that's a Roman Catholic, because under those circumstances, you may want to have last rites, and you should call a priest is the right answer. You're going to die, get a priest. Don't get an ambulance under those circumstances. So it varies. And so that's what makes it hard. That's what makes it hard, making these decisions, just as it is for abortion and capital punishment and lethal autonomous weapons and smoking. It's very hard to come up with concrete answers that everyone will agree with, and that's what ethics is about, by and large. How do we come to consensus to guide policy and the like? The major frameworks are the deontological framework, as I mentioned, Kantian theory as well, too, but the utilitarian, which is to maximize happiness across them, and if it's ethically correct to do so. So in summary, again, there's no guidelines for the use or not use of robot deception in this particular space. And we need to figure out what those are. There's a major initiative going on right now, if you're interested in the global, it's the IEEE Global Initiative on Ethics of Autonomous Systems, involving 100 plus researchers and scientists and policymakers and some philosophers trying to come to grips with guidelines and standards for this. A report just came out earlier this month on V1.0 of this. I head the Affective Computing Committee on that, and I'm a member of the Executive Committee. If you have any questions, just either Google it or Google me, and I'll be glad to point you in the right direction. The last quick thing is nudges. We've published a couple of papers as to whether we should make robots encourage you to be more charitable, to be a better human being, whether we should engineer into the robot little cues, like you may have seen the cartoons with the white angel sitting on your shoulder, whispering into your ear. That would be a good thing to do. Or reinforcing, that would be a bad thing to do. What if we could do that? What if we created companions that could force a morality upon you? Is that appropriate? Is that ethically valid to do that? Should you be allowed to opt in or opt out? So this whole notion of nudging is one thing that we've been exploring in that space. So with that, I'll conclude, point you to these particular resources, and thank you very much for your attention.
We are a little short on time, so we can take maybe only one question.
About the robots that you're using for people with Parkinson's. You said that they want a robot to intervene in situations where, like, they might be shouting or just rudeness, something like that. But I'm curious to know, is there any concern that patients who have these robots might feel like they're becoming dependent on these robots, or like that the robots are babysitting them and essentially taking away their independence?
That's an interesting question. I can't speak to that directly because we haven't done a formal study in that, but what we've tried to do is see if they understand that this is just something in the background, more like a pet, which is not, the real question, is it invading their privacy would be another aspect. Is it recording everything they do? And we assure them in the studies that it is not. The notion of these robots, it's not we want them, we are trying to find out, or they want them, we're trying to find out if this works in the first place. So that's the basic science that we're addressing in this. And we are, again, at the very beginnings of it. We need to be very sensitive to our context. But keep in mind, again, it's not just watching the patient, it's watching the physician or the clinician as well, too, because they also step out of line as well, too, in this loss of empathy. And the goal is to try and cue them back in to exhibit that. So if the first part works before the ethical governor kicks in, where it starts saying, you shouldn't be doing that, or let's talk about this, or something along those lines, if we get the first part right with the dog on the sofa kind of thing, where it's just quizzically looking or doing things to make, raising its hackles, or whatever the human analog is in this case, if we can get those nonverbal communications to work, hopefully it will vanish into the background. And that's really the goal. What morphology or what shape it should take is something that we're exploring again. You've seen several examples there. We also considered basically a video screen on a stick, basically, that would roll around. So there's different types of ways in which it can be done. But you're right, we need to be sensitive to what is acceptable by those folks as well, too. And otherwise, we lose, as I said in the beginning. Thank you.
So on behalf of Armida University and the RAHA Organization Committee, we would like to thank Professor Arkin for his very informative talk on civilized collaboration and pointing out the importance of ethics in robotics. Despite what some journalists say, we are very happy that he didn't keep his research and ideas to himself.